two of the most notorious empires ever established, the Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire, the former lasting from 27 BCE to 476 CE, and the latter existing between 1299 and 1922. With a combined duration of well over 1,000 years between them, the Roman or Ottoman empires might not have existed during the same time, but both had enough military strength and political power to maintain control over vast swaths of the world at their heights. But if these two historical continent-spanning powerhouses were to clash, which would emerge as the victor? Let's start by defining what exactly an empire is and then compare the scope of both these examples from history. An empire is a political structure wherein people are ruled over by a single authority figure who holds all the power, an emperor or an empress. For example, the Roman Empire began with the reign of Emperor Augustus Caesar, who gave himself the position following the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire actually derives its name from the anglicized version of its first sultan's name. Osman Gazi, or Osman I, was a Turkish tribal leader in Anatolia who conquered neighboring regions and established his own rule over the lands he inherited or captured. In Italy, Osman was known as Ottomano, which gave us the English version Ottoman, which is now forever associated with his dynasty. The Ottoman dynasty was able to expand its reign through extensive raids into areas that had previously been controlled by the Christian Byzantine Empire and the former rulers of Anatolia, the Seljuk dynasty. They'd been weakened after suffering defeats at the hands of the Mongol invasion, allowing this new rising power to form. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire spread outwards from what's now modern-day Turkey, reaching northwards as far as Austria and Vienna, all the way to the Persian Gulf in the east, encompassing everything up to and including Algeria in the west and extending down to Yemen in the south. In 1595, the empire included areas of Turkey, Egypt, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Macedonia, Hungary, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa. In total, that was almost 20 million square kilometers. On the other historical hand, the Roman Empire's territorial expansion was only around a quarter of that size, at its peak reaching about 5 million square kilometers. It spanned 3 continents, including Northern Africa and Asia Minor, as well as most of Europe. While it might not have been as geographically large as the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire did at one point become so large that it had to be split into eastern and western parts, which were each ruled over by their own emperor. Similarly, control over the fledgling Ottoman Empire was divided among a formal government as the Ottoman Turks expanded their territory. The figurehead was Osman I, working alongside other leaders, including Orhan, Murad I, and Bayezid I. It's also important to get to grips with the history of each of these empires to understand how they were able to maintain their hold over power on such an international scale. Sometime around the year 1299, Osman I declared himself the supreme leader of Anatolia, also called Asia Minor. After he'd become the founding sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Osman's numerous successors had the job of further expanding the empire into territories that had previously been under Christian Byzantine control. With much of their expansion aided by foreign mercenaries, the Byzantine Empire would eventually be toppled by Osman's descendants, known as the Ottomans, in 1453 when they captured the city of Constantinople. The city seemed to be impossible to conquer, but once the Ottomans had taken control of it, it was established as the new capital of their empire and renamed. Fun fact, and one that actually indirectly links the two empires we're discussing in this video, Constantinople was the city's original name, named after Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor of Rome. After the Ottomans conquered it, the city became known as Istanbul. That's right, Istanbul was Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. So if you have a date in Constantinople, she'll be waiting in Istanbul. The Ottoman Empire continued its expansion across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans. Being a dynasty typically means that rule was passed through generations of the same family. However, in the case of the Ottomans, there was only one role that could be inherited: the supreme ruler or sultan. Other members of the Ottoman Empire's elite had to earn high-ranking positions, regardless of what family they were born into. The peak of the Ottomans' power and influence came with the rule of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. During the 16th century, under his reign, arts, technology, and architecture within the empire all reached new heights. Generally, there was peace and religious tolerance, as well as economic and political stability within the countries under the Ottomans' control. But as idyllic as that might have sounded, it was far from a perfect system. The imperial rule meant that slavery was common, with female slaves forced to serve as concubines and male slaves made to provide hard labor. Additionally, if a sultan had any brothers, then they weren't living the good life with the rest of the family. Instead, many were either killed or imprisoned in order to make sure there was nobody around to challenge the sultan's claim to the throne. It was during the century following the reign of Sultan Mehmed II that the Ottoman Empire achieved its peak of power and wealth, with a reach extending well into Central Europe. At its height, the Ottoman Empire was massive, but it had started to lose its footing and influence over Europe as the 17th century approached. For many years, the Ottomans had no shortage of new territories to conquer and assimilate into their empire. However, when they made a second failed attempt to expand into Vienna in 1683, the strength of the Ottoman Empire began to falter. Multiple factors, including new trade routes competing with their own, and the growing strength of countries in Europe, and the start of the Industrial Revolution, were all also partly to blame for destabilizing the empire. By the time the 19th century rolled around, some even mockingly referred to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, thanks to its territories rapidly dwindling and an economic decline that led to the empire becoming increasingly dependent on Europe. However, the one thing to end the Ottoman Empire once and for all was the First World War. In their already weakened state, the Sultan at the time, Abdul Hamid II, briefly considered reforming the empire into a constitutional monarchy, wherein the monarch had no direct power over the ruling people, instead leaving the power to the government. He would seemingly change his tune during the late 1870s, but in 1908, the Young Turks, a political reform movement, staged a revolt in order to restore the constitutional rights of the people of the Ottoman Empire. Seizing control over the empire, the Young Turks wanted to strengthen it, which caused friction with their neighbors in the Balkans. As a result, the Balkan Wars soon followed, and this resulted in the empire losing 33% of its remaining territory, along with 20% of its population. As the First World War approached, the weakened Ottoman Empire entered into a secret alliance with Germany, which ended up having disastrous consequences. They suffered heavy casualties, with over two-thirds of their military lost during the war, as well as 3 million civilians. A few short years after World War I ended, Turkish nationalists were able to successfully abolish the ruling sultanate in 1922, which brought an end to one of history's most successful empires. Even further back in time, the Roman Empire emerged in the wake of arguably one of the most infamous murders in ancient history. Julius Caesar was a Roman statesman and general who installed himself as a dictator over the Roman Republic. It was because of this that he was murdered by a group of his political adversaries, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's supporters, along with Caesar's great-nephew and heir Octavian, joined forces to eliminate Brutus and Cassius out of retribution. This led to a divided Rome, with a power split between Mark Antony, Octavian, and another ex-consul named Lepidus. Octavian was placed in charge of leading the western provinces, while Antony oversaw the east and Lepidus was charged with control of Africa. However, tensions arose between the group around 36 BC, leading to their triumvirate soon falling apart. Octavian's forces battled against those of Mark Antony and Queen Cleopatra of Egypt in the Battle of Actium. Having been defeated, the devastated pair met their ends shortly after. Spoiler warning if you've never read Shakespeare's play about it. This left Octavian as the sole leader of Rome, as well as all the provinces it controlled. Having the knowledge of the fate that had befallen Julius Caesar, Octavian sought to ensure that his position of power would not be threatened. But one of Caesar's biggest problems with trying to assume power over Rome was that the public didn't like the idea of a single ruler with absolute power. So Octavian needed the Roman public on his side and used a trick still favored by politicians desperately seeking to keep hold of their power to this day. He lied to the people. Big surprise. On the outside, Octavian looked to be restoring the political institution that governed the Roman Republic. But in reality, he was doing so in a way that meant he retained all the real ruling power. In 27 BC, Octavian assumed the title of Augustus and thus became the first emperor of Rome. Before this, Rome had been through 100 years of corruption and conflict, but the rule of the newly named Augustus ushered in 2 entire centuries of peace and prosperity for the empire, referred to as the famous Pax Romana. Augustus used his new power to enact various social reforms, as well as securing quite a few military victories. With the people's morale boosted, Roman literature, art, architecture, and religion all began to flourish. Overall, Augustus's rule lasted for 56 years, with support from his army and their devotion to him as an emperor. When he eventually died, the Roman Senate revered Caesar Augustus as a god, and this began a long-running tradition of popular emperors being deified after their passing. However, Augustus's successors didn't exactly all share his popularity. His dynasty included Tiberius between 14 and 37 AD, Caligula from 37 to 41 AD, a bloodthirsty and unstable madman, and thirdly was Emperor Claudius, who ruled until 51 AD and was best remembered for his army's conquering of Britain. Their ruling bloodline ended with Emperor Nero, whose reign culminated in 68 AD after he drained the Roman treasury with his excess, leading to his own dishonorable demise. The Roman Empire itself would continue, though, with several emperors assuming the throne following Nero's death: Vespasian and his successors, Titus and Domitian, known as the Flavians. Given the tumultuous state that Nero had left things in, these emperors had the difficult task of restoring the Senate's authority and promoting the welfare of the Roman people. Titus in particular received a lot of their devotion due to how he handled recovery efforts in the wake of the infamous eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which destroyed the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Now that we know some of the important historical context surrounding them both, let's get down to what really matters. Which empire could beat the other in a fight? Well, to answer that, let's take a look at two of the greatest assets at the disposal of both the Roman and Ottoman empires. It's largely how they were able to maintain the control that they had over their territories and continued their expansions into new ones: their militaries. How about we start with the soldiers of the Roman Empire? Ancient Rome has long been famed for possessing one of the largest armies to ever exist before the modern age. At the empire's height, the Roman army consisted of well over 400,000 legionnaires and auxiliaries. Much of the Roman world revolved around the army as an important institution, and their military played a key role in the rise of the Roman Empire's power. However, the way it played that role was somewhat different under Imperial Rome than it had been beforehand. Earlier, during the days of the Roman Republic, the military's primary function was to act in service of the Senate, who represented the Roman people. Then, during the empire that succeeded the Republic, the role and structure of the military was altered. Duties like protecting borders and territories were outsourced to foreign mercenaries who were commanded by Roman officers. The army as an institution became less Roman, and when the empire eventually descended into a mess of warring factions, they were unable to keep other invading armies out, thus leading to the empire's downfall. That being said, in its prime, the Roman army was one of the most successful in history. The world over, their soldiers were feared, thanks to their intense physical training, the discipline of their willpower, and their impressive weaponry for the time. Few other armies at the time could rival the Roman legion's fighting prowess. When Augustus came to power as the first emperor of Rome, his army contained 60 legions, each divided into 10 cohorts of up to 480 men. The minimum service a soldier had to complete was 20 years, and the length of this service, combined with the hardships of life in the military, meant that Roman soldiers developed close personal bonds with their fellow soldiers. Given the role that the army played in Roman society, one of the most essential tasks for an emperor was ensuring he maintained the loyalty of those troops. An army enacting a mutiny was a concern for many emperors and could undermine his power both in Rome and the further reaches of the empire, since that power was based on whether or not he could keep control of his forces. In 14 AD, just after Tiberius had come to power as an emperor, a mutiny broke out among some of the Roman legions in Central Europe, with soldiers complaining that Rome wasn't making good on the promises it made them. Since they were the primary tool for expansion and exerting control, the Roman army was essentially responsible for the actual building of the Roman Empire, and if they turned on the emperor, control of all the empire's territories lay in the hands of its soldiers. Equally, the armies of the Ottoman Empire weren't to be sniffed at either. Their forces were largely dominated by Turkish soldiers, given that more than half the empire's population was Turkish. Conscripts who signed up to join the ranks of the army came from all manner of ethnic groups, but the officer class was almost entirely Turkish. The first Ottoman army was composed almost entirely of a nomadic cavalry force, most of whom had converted to Islam when Osman I merged them together out of the various Turkmen tribes from western Anatolia. Later, as more foreign mercenaries joined the Ottoman army's ranks, they were not required to convert to Islam as long as they obeyed the Ottoman commanders. Their forces fought with a range of weapons, including bows and arrows and spears. Their main forces were cavalrymen who lived mostly on the spoils they gained from raiding Byzantine Christian lands, furthering the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into different territories. Speaking of those early raids, they saw these horsemen used as an irregular force of shock troops, armed with bows and spears. Some of them were also given fiefs, areas of land given up as a reward for their service, which were referred to as timars. This meant soldiers could essentially be given an estate in the lands they helped to conquer, incentivizing their service to the growing Ottoman Empire. That and the wealth they acquired during military campaigns no doubt gave them a few good reasons to stay in service of the empire. Eventually, the Ottomans organized their army to receive a paid salary rather than just paying them through looting or fiefs. The infantry, called yayas, and the cavalry, known as musalems, were mostly made up of foreign mercenaries. The money appealed to them as a reward, but very few Turks were content with accepting a salary in place of timars. In terms of equipment, the Ottomans might have started out with more medieval weapons when their empire first began, but that soon changed. They began using guns in the late 14th century, at which point newer types of troops that utilized this emerging weaponry began to appear. There were musketeers, called piade topsu, which literally translates to foot artillery, as well as cavalry armed with guns similar to the later European carabiner. The Ottomans also had their own bombardiers, known as kaldhumbarachi. These units consisted of grenadier troops who would hurl explosives, called kimbara, in the direction of enemy forces. Additionally, there were soldiers who provided maintenance and powder to artillery. The Ottomans were some of the earliest adopters of gunpowder artillery, making them a part of their military so quickly that they actually had specialized troops trained to handle firearms before many of their adversaries in Europe and the Middle East did. But it was their use of artillery that really shocked their adversaries. They had access to early artillery weapons from as early as Bayezid I, and they even used these weapons during the sieges of Constantinople in 1399 and 1402. Where they had initially been mostly cavalrymen and infantry wielding bows and arrows, they were now trained with firearms, becoming arguably one of the first military forces in the world to be equipped with guns. Now, you might think that access to firearms so much earlier than their European counterparts would give the Ottoman Empire a significant enough advantage to defeat Roman legionnaires with relative ease. After all, the Romans come from a time centuries before the invention of firearms, but that isn't to say they weren't without specialized gear of their own. To aid in their service to the Roman Empire, they had numerous different types of weapons that often offered them an advantage over their enemies, who were primarily barbarian armies. The three primary Roman weapons utilized by the military were the pilum, the gladius, and the pugio. The pilum was a long, lightweight javelin approximately 7 feet in length, with a long iron spike at the end of a wooden shaft. Despite being pretty heavy, weighing over 4 pounds, the pilum was usually thrown at an enemy in order to pierce right through shields and armor. The pilum could stick into an enemy's shield, rendering it useless and forcing its wielder to abandon their protection, leaving them vulnerable in close-quarters combat. With an enemy's personal defense lowered, Roman soldiers could then get in close and fight an enemy with much less armor. Up close, they typically wield a gladius, a short, double-edged sword used during the later years of the Roman Republic. This would continue into the Roman Empire as the primary weapon of the Roman legions. The gladius was a sword that included a hilt, rivet knob, pommel, hand grip, and handguard. These short swords were specifically crafted with strength and flexibility in mind. Blacksmiths making them would use harder steel on the outer layers of the sword, while making the center of the blade with softer steel to keep the weapon more lightweight. If by some stroke of bad luck a legionnaire was disarmed of his gladius, he'd still have a pugio, and this was a military dagger made famous for being the weapon used to assassinate Julius Caesar. At only around 15 to 30 centimeters in length, this made the pugio easy to conceal for use in close-quarters combat if a Roman soldier had lost his gladius. When it comes down to the wire, it's hard to say exactly who would win if the Roman and Ottoman empires were to clash. Given that they existed later in history and had access to more advanced equipment because of it, perhaps the Ottoman forces would be able to overpower the Romans with sheer brute force. However, the Roman legions were also famed for overcoming tough opponents when the odds were stacked against them. Their tactics were second to none and proved effective on more than one battlefield. In terms of the sheer size and scope of their territory, the Ottoman Empire might have had the Roman Empire beat. But neither of these ancient powerhouses were without their weaknesses either. An empire getting larger and expanding into new regions would extend its reach and control, but that could also lead to its forces being spread too thin and could cause issues that more often than not disrupted its army's ability to function. After all, as many deposed leaders would tell you, if they weren't killed, an army that you can't support with food and supplies is an army that won't fight for you. Now go check out what caused the Roman Empire to collapse, or watch this video instead.